The Florida sun was beating down on the back of my neck like a physical weight, thick and suffocating. It was one of those miserable August afternoons in Spring Hill where the humidity is sitting at, like 98%, and you can practically drink the air. I was standing in my own backyard, sweating through a perfectly good gray t-shirt, holding a half-empty can of lukewarm sparkling water. I didn't break eye contact. I couldn't. On one side of my 4-foot galvanized chain-link fence stood me, a regular guy, an independent contractor who spends most of his week meticulously tracking spreadsheets and 1099 tax forms just to keep my life organized. I like order. I like quiet. I like coming out to my backyard and not being bothered by the absolute insanity of the outside world. And on the other side of that fence stood Brenda. Brenda was the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. Whispering Pines was one of those sprawling cookie-cutter subdivisions that popped up out of nowhere, right on the edge of the swampy Florida wilderness. You know the type. Every house is painted one of 3 approved shades of beige. Every mailbox has to be completely identical. Every blade of grass is scrutinized. Brenda took her job as HOA President not just as a responsibility, but as a divine calling. She was armed, as always, with her signature weapon, a cracked, oversized neon green clipboard. Her hair was heavily sprayed into a rigid, impenetrable helmet of frosted blonde that somehow defied the swampy humidity. Her eyes were narrowed into venomous, calculating slits behind a pair of wire-rimmed transition lenses that hadn't quite transitioned back from the harsh glare of the sun. And caught directly in the crossfire of this suburban Cold War, Henrietta. Henrietta was a Rhode Island red chicken. She was slightly cross-eyed, incredibly docile, and currently pecking at a very interesting piece of gravel near my left sneaker. She didn't know what a homeowners association was. She didn't know what a covenant, condition, or restriction was. She just knew that June bugs tasted fantastic, and that I occasionally tossed her a handful of dried mealworms when I needed a break from my laptop. "I am going to say this one more time, and I am not going to repeat myself," Brenda hissed. Her voice had this terrifying, vibrating quality to it. It was the kind of forced, sickly sweet patience usually reserved for unruly toddlers in a grocery store. Livestock is strictly prohibited in the Whispering Pines Community Guidelines. Article 4, Section 12. I took a slow, agonizingly deliberate sip of my sparkling water. The carbonation burned the back of my throat. I let out a refreshed sigh, just to watch her eye twitch. "Brenda," I said, keeping my voice dangerously level. "Look at her. Look at this animal. Does she look like livestock to you? She weighs maybe 4 pounds soaking wet. My neighbor's golden retriever takes dumps bigger than Henrietta. She's a pet." "She is poultry," Brenda snapped. She jabbed a manicured acrylic nail at the chain-link fence, the metal rattling aggressively. "Poultry is livestock. You are operating an unapproved agricultural nuisance, and I am issuing a formal citation right now." Henrietta, sensing the sudden spike in negative energy, let out a soft, confused balk and waddled behind my ankle for protection. I had 2 other hens, Beatrice and Mabel. They were currently napping under the dense, waxy shade of my overgrown hibiscus bush, completely oblivious to the legal peril they were supposedly in. I had bought the 3 of them exactly 2 weeks ago. Groceries were getting insanely expensive. A carton of decent eggs was practically a luxury item, and my wife and I had a 1/4 acre of fenced-in backyard that was doing absolutely nothing but growing crabgrass and weeds. My wife thought it was a fun idea. She even picked out Mabel. It made sense. It was quiet. It was harmless. It was sustainable. "Brenda, it's a bird," I said, leaning my forearm against the hot metal fence post. "It doesn't bark at the mailman. It doesn't leave tire marks on the freshly paved asphalt. It doesn't throw loud parties at 2 a.m. It just sits there, eats bugs, and occasionally produces breakfast. What is the actual, tangible problem here? The problem is the rules." She was practically vibrating with self-righteous indignation now. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the green clipboard. "If I let you keep farm animals, what's next? Cows? Pigs? A slaughterhouse in the cul-de-sac? We have property values to maintain. Expect a $50 fine in the mail. And if that chicken isn't gone by Friday, the fine doubles." She spun on her heel. Her sensible orthopedic walking shoes crunched aggressively on the pavement. I watched her march back toward her pristine, aggressively manicured fortress of a house 3 doors down. She didn't look back once. I looked down at Henrietta. She tilted her head, looking up at me with one beady, deeply confused eye. "Well," I muttered, crushing the aluminum can in my hand. "Looks like we're outlaws." I honestly didn't take the threat seriously at first. I really didn't. I figured it was just Brenda being Brenda. She was legendary in Spring Hill for her absolute lack of chill. This was a woman who once measured a teenager's grass with a literal plastic school ruler to prove it was a 1/4 inch over the mandated height. She had slapped a fine on a 6-year-old for leaving a pink Barbie tricycle in a driveway for more than 2 hours. I thought the whole chicken thing would blow over in a few days once she found someone else's misery to fixate on. I was so incredibly wrong. 3 days later, the first envelope arrived. It was crisp. It was heavy bond paper. It bore the dreaded, embossed pine tree logo of the Whispering Pines HOA in the top left corner. I was standing in my kitchen, sipping a cup of black coffee, when I tore it open. $50. Violation of Article 4, Section 12, unauthorized livestock. I scoffed, tossed it onto the kitchen counter next to my laptop, and walked out the back door to check the nesting boxes. I reached into the pine shavings and pulled out 2 fresh, warm, brown eggs. Worth it. I wasn't going to let some suburban dictator bully me out of my breakfast. But then, the following Monday, a second envelope arrived. $100. Failure to cure violation. Escalation of penalty. Then, exactly 3 days after that, a third envelope showed up in my mailbox. This one cited a brand new, entirely fabricated violation. Noxious odors and vermin attraction. I literally marched outside, stood in the absolute dead center of my yard, closed my eyes, and inhaled deeply. It smelled like cut grass, damp earth, and Florida humidity. My coop was completely spotless. I cleaned it meticulously every single morning before I logged on for work. I used premium pine shavings that smelled like a lumberjack's cologne. There was absolutely zero smell. There were no rats. There were no mice. She was entirely making things up to build a paper trail. My wife took one look at the stack of fines on the counter and sighed. "Just pay it," she said, shaking her head. "It's $150. Pay it, we'll rehome the girls to that farm out in Brooksville, and we'll be done with it. It's not worth the stress." But the thing is, I couldn't do it. It wasn't about the eggs anymore. It wasn't even about Henrietta, Beatrice, and Mabel. It was about the absolute, unchecked arrogance. It was the terrifying reality that this woman felt completely entitled to control every square inch of my life on property that I paid a heavy mortgage for. I decided to play by the rules one last time. The next Tuesday evening was the monthly HOA board meeting at the community clubhouse. I prepared for it like it was a corporate quarterly review. I put on a crisp button-down shirt. I printed out 12 pages of peer-reviewed research on urban microflux. I pulled up decibel statistics proving that a laying hen is actually quieter than a standard central air conditioning unit. I had pie charts. I had graphs. I walked into that clubhouse ready to present a flawless, logical, bulletproof defense. The clubhouse was heavily air-conditioned, freezing cold, and smelled sharply of stale Folgers coffee and industrial floor wax. Brenda sat at the absolute center of a long, white folding table at the front of the room. She was flanked by 4 other board members who all looked completely miserable, terrified to even breathe without checking for her approval first. When it was my turn on the agenda, I stood at the podium. I delivered my speech. I was charming. I was factual. I smiled. I laid out the environmental benefits of backyard composting. I even offered to share my surplus eggs with the board members as a peace offering. Brenda didn't even look up from her clipboard. She let me finish my entire presentation. Then she let 3 agonizing, heavy seconds of dead silence hang in the freezing air. She reached out and tapped her silver pen against her microphone. Tap, tap. "Request for variance denied," she said flatly, her voice completely devoid of human emotion. "The fines stand. Remove the poultry by Friday, or we will escalate the enforcement actions to the maximum extent permitted by the bylaws. Next on the agenda, Mrs. Gable's unauthorized marigolds in the front flower bed." A few of the other board members actually chuckled. A low, snide, elitist chuckle. They laughed me right out of the room. I walked back to my house under the flickering amber streetlights, my blood absolutely boiling in my veins. My jaw was clenched so tight my teeth hurt. I was not going to pay those fines. I was not going to submit. I was going to dig my heels in until the concrete cracked. Over the next 3 weeks, a suffocating cold war settled over my property line. I kept the chickens in the yard. Brenda kept sending the certified letters, and the administrative fees began to pile up. It was a complete racket. A $50 fine morphed into $200 of late fees, $300 in legal review charges, and processing penalties. It was a scam designed to bleed normal homeowners dry until they submitted out of pure financial exhaustion. Then came the Tuesday afternoon that finally broke the camel's back. I was sitting in my lawn chair in the backyard. The brutal humidity had actually broken for a few hours, leaving a nice, salty breeze rolling in off the Gulf. I had a cold beer in my right hand, and I was casually tossing small, sweet chunks of watermelon rind into the grass. The girls were making these happy, soft, trilling noises, playing keep-away with a particularly juicy piece of fruit. It was peaceful. It was perfect. Suddenly, the unmistakable, aggressive whoop-whoop of a police siren chirped from my driveway. I froze. My stomach dropped. I set my beer down on the grass, stood up, and slowly walked to the side gate. I peered through the chain link, and my breath caught in my throat. 2 Hernando County Sheriff's deputies were aggressively marching up my driveway, and they looked like they were ready for a fight. Have you ever had the cops called on you while you were literally just sitting in a lawn chair eating fruit? Because I highly recommend against it. It is not a fun experience. My heart instantly started hammering against my ribs. I watched through the chain link fence as these 2 deputies marched up my concrete driveway. They weren't just strolling either. They had that aggressive, tactical walk. Their thumbs were hooked casually but securely into their heavy, black leather duty belts, resting inches away from their tasers and sidearms. The afternoon sun was glinting off their badges and their dark aviator sunglasses. They were fully scanning the property with the weary, guarded expressions of guys who fully expected to be walking into an active domestic dispute, a raging neighborhood brawl, or a meth lab explosion. The static from their shoulder radios crackled loudly, cutting through the quiet hum of the suburban afternoon. I took a deep breath, wiped my sweaty palms on my jeans, and opened the gate. "Can I help you, officers?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from shaking. The taller deputy, a guy with a thick, imposing mustache and a neck as wide as a tree trunk, stopped and looked at me. He looked me up and down, taking in my gray t-shirt and the piece of watermelon rind I was still awkwardly holding in my left hand. "Are you the homeowner?" he asked, his voice a deep, authoritative baritone. "I am." I nodded, stepping back just a fraction of an inch. "We got an urgent call from a neighbor," the second deputy said. He was a bit shorter, younger, and had his hand resting on his radio. He read from a small notepad. Claimed there was a severe noise disturbance, an active public health hazard, and, quote, highly erratic and dangerous behavior at this address. I stared at them. I literally couldn't speak for a full 3 seconds. My brain was completely short-circuiting. Erratic behavior? I finally managed to choke out. Yes, sir, the mustached deputy said, his posture stiffening just a bit. Now, do you mind if we step into the backyard to investigate the hazard? I looked at the cops. I looked at the backyard. And then I looked back at the cops. By all means, I said, swinging the gate wide open and gesturing toward the grass. Please, brace yourselves. It's a real war zone back here. The 2 deputies exchanged a quick, tactical look, clearly thinking I was being a smartass and preparing for the worst. They stepped cautiously into my backyard, their hands hovering near their belts. They looked left. They looked right. They checked the blind spots near the side of the house. And what did they see? They saw a neatly mowed patch of green Florida grass. They saw a small, pristine, wooden chicken coop painted to perfectly match the beige trim of my house. And they saw 3 fat, lazy chickens completely passed out in the shade of a patio chair, absolutely comatose after devouring half a watermelon. The silence stretched for about 10 agonizing seconds. The only sound in the entire neighborhood was the distant, droning hum of somebody's lawnmower 2 streets over. The mustached deputy slowly lowered his aviator sunglasses down the bridge of his nose. He stared at Henrietta. Henrietta was currently snoring softly, with one brown wing draped awkwardly over an exposed tree root, looking like a tiny, feathered drunkard. "Sir?" the tall deputy said slowly, completely dropping his tactical stance. "Is this the health hazard?" I crossed my arms and leaned against the gate. "That's Henrietta," I replied, pointing to the sleeping bird. "She is highly dangerous if you happen to be a grub worm or a piece of cracked corn. Otherwise, she's fairly low-key." The second deputy let out a sudden, sharp snort of laughter. He quickly turned away, coughing into his fist to cover it up, his shoulders shaking slightly. "I see," the mustached deputy said, fighting a very obvious losing battle against a smile. He pushed his sunglasses back up. "And the noise disturbance?" "They cluck sometimes," I offered helpfully. "Usually around 8 in the morning when they lay an egg. It's about as loud as someone clearing their throat. Sometimes Mabel over there gets a little chatty if she sees a squirrel, but that's about it." The deputies looked at each other again. This time, there was no tactical assessment. The pure, unadulterated exhaustion of dealing with suburban neighborhood drama washed over both of their faces simultaneously. It was the look of 2 men who were violently underpaid for the nonsense they had to put up with. The mustached deputy took his sunglasses off entirely, folded them, and hooked them into his shirt collar. He pinched the bridge of his nose and let out a long, heavy sigh. "Let me guess," he said, looking at me with exhausted solidarity. "Brenda?" I blinked, low-key shocked that he knew her by name. "You guys know Brenda?" "Buddy," the younger deputy said, shaking his head and chuckling. "We all know Brenda. We are dispatched to her house at least twice a month for unauthorized parking complaints, kids playing too loud on the sidewalk, and garbage cans left out past 5 p.m. She told the dispatcher you were operating an illegal, unsanitary slaughterhouse in a residential zone." "I named them," I said, gesturing wildly to the sleeping birds. "Who names their slaughterhouse inventory? That's Mabel, and the one drooling on the patio stone is Beatrice." The cops were completely amused now, but mostly they were profoundly annoyed at Brenda for wasting county emergency resources. They took a slow walk around the yard, gave the pristine wooden coop a cursory glance just to say they did their official due diligence for the report, and headed back toward the gate. "Listen, man," the tall deputy said, stopping at the fence line and putting his hands on his hips. "You aren't breaking any county laws. Hernando County zoning actually allows backyard poultry in residential zones as long as there are no roosters and you keep it clean, which you obviously do. It's perfectly legal." "But the HOA?" I asked, feeling a tiny spark of hope ignite in my chest. "That's a civil matter," he replied, holding his hands up defensively. "We are law enforcement. We don't enforce HOA covenants. That's a private contract between you and the board. But as far as the Hernando County Sheriff's Office is concerned, you're totally fine. Have a great afternoon. And tell Henrietta I said hi." I watched their cruiser back out of the driveway and roll down the street. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. A massive rush of vindication flooded my system. The cops were on my side. The actual, literal law was on my side. Brenda had overplayed her hand, tried to swat me with the police, and totally failed. I was safe. That incredible, victorious feeling lasted for exactly 24 hours. The next afternoon, right around 2 o'clock, the mail carrier pulled up to my house. But she didn't just drop the mail in the box and drive away. She walked up the driveway, holding a thick, heavy, oversized manila envelope, and she asked for my signature. My stomach instantly tied itself into a knot. I signed the little digital scanner, thanked her, and walked slowly back inside. The envelope wasn't from the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. It didn't have their little pine tree logo. The return address belonged to a high-end corporate law firm based out of a skyscraper in downtown Tampa. I carried it over to the kitchen island. I grabbed a butter knife and sliced the thick paper open. I pulled out a stack of dense, heavily legalistic documents printed on premium paper. The bold, all-caps heading at the top of the first page practically jumped out and punched me in the throat. Notice of intent to record a claim of lien and initiate foreclosure proceedings. My legs actually went weak. I pulled out a bar stool and sat down heavily. The legal jargon swam on the page, blurring together in front of my eyes. Because I had ignored the initial $50 fine, and because of the absurd compounding administrative fees, the daily late penalties, and now the attorney retainer fees, the HOA was officially claiming that I owed them $2,500. I frantically read through the Florida property statutes they had cited in the document. Under state law, if an HOA fine exceeds $1,000, the association has the legal right to place a lien on your property. A lien is basically a legal hold on your deed, and if you don't pay the lien within a specified time frame, they have the absolute legal authority to foreclose on your house, to seize your property, auction it off to pay the debt, and evict you. Over a chicken. Brenda wasn't just trying to take my pets away anymore. She wasn't just trying to bully me into submission. She had actually weaponized the legal system to try and take my home. I read the letter 3 times. My hands were visibly shaking. The sheer, terrifying power that these petty, unelected neighborhood tyrants wielded was mind-boggling. They could literally render you homeless, destroy your credit, and ruin your life because you refused to comply with a fabricated rule about a bird. The panic set in first. It was a cold, gripping terror that started in my chest and spread down to my fingertips. I paced the kitchen. I opened my banking app on my phone and stared at the numbers. I didn't have $2,500 in liquid cash just sitting around to throw away on a bogus, extortionate fine. And I definitely didn't have the $10,000 or $20,000 it would take to hire a defense attorney to fight a massive, heavily funded HOA management company in civil court. I was just a regular guy. They were a corporate entity with a bottomless war chest funded by my own mandatory monthly dues. I walked over to the back sliding glass door and looked out at the yard. Henrietta was pecking happily at the glass, looking for more watermelon, totally oblivious to the fact that her existence was about to cost me the roof over my head if I gave up. If I surrendered the chickens, signed a payment plan for the fines, and publicly apologized to Brenda, I could keep my house. It was the safe thing to do. It was the adult thing to do. But as I stood there, pressing my forehead against the cool glass, looking at that little cross-eyed bird, the panic slowly began to evaporate. It was replaced by something else entirely. It wasn't anger. Anger is hot and messy and makes you do stupid things. This was something cold. Something meticulously calculating. Something incredibly, dangerously malicious. She wanted to use the law against me? Fine. I would use the law to absolutely bury her. I walked over to my desk, flipped open my laptop, and cracked my knuckles. I didn't need a civil defense attorney. I needed a loophole. I spent the next 14 hours straight glued to the glowing screen of my monitor. I drank 3 entire pots of black coffee. I fell down massive, twisting, complex rabbit holes of Florida property statutes, county zoning codes, state agricultural ordinances, and legal precedents. I read through every single line, every single comma of the Whispering Pines, HOA Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. Here is the thing about HOAs. They are incredibly powerful, but their power comes from contract law. When you buy a house in a deed-restricted community, you sign the deed, and you agree to their specific set of private rules. It's a private contract between a corporation and a homeowner. Local cops can't override it. City councils rarely touch it. I needed something bigger than local zoning. I needed something that preempted the private contract entirely. I needed the absolute, undeniable power of the state government. At 3:14 a.m., with my eyes burning out of my skull and my vision getting blurry from the blue light, I found it. I stared at the screen. I literally read the paragraph out loud to my empty kitchen, just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating from the sheer volume of caffeine pumping through my veins. Florida Statutes. Section 823.14, better known in legal circles as the Florida Right to Farm Act. It was a beautiful, glorious, flawless piece of state legislation. It was originally designed decades ago to protect old, established orange groves and massive cattle ranches from being sued out of existence by rich, out-of-state developers who built luxury subdivisions next door and then complained about the smell of manure. But as I read the exact, literal wording of the law, a massive, evil grin spread across my exhausted face. The law stated, in extremely clear, undeniable terms, that a local government, a county, a municipality, or any other local entity could not adopt any ordinance, regulation, rule, or policy to prohibit, restrict, regulate, or otherwise limit an activity of a bona fide farm operation on land classified as agricultural. Furthermore, I clicked over to the Florida Greenbelt Law. This was the kicker. If a property is officially recognized, inspected, and classified by the state and the county property appraiser as being used for bona fide commercial agricultural purposes, local zoning and HOA rules regarding land use are entirely superseded by state agricultural protections. State law trumps HOA contracts. Always. Without exception. If my backyard was officially designated as a farm, Brenda's rules didn't just not apply to me, they were legally void. Unenforceable. Dead in the water. But there was a massive, glaring catch. I read through the stringent requirements for the Right to Farm Act. 3 pet chickens sitting in a wooden box in a suburban backyard did not constitute a bona fide commercial agricultural operation. The state government wasn't stupid. They knew people would try to use this exact loophole just to get out of mowing their lawns or painting their fences. To qualify for the protection, you had to prove a legitimate, good-faith commercial intent. You needed volume. You needed infrastructure. You had to produce an actual agricultural product that was intended for market sale. 3 chickens simply wouldn't cut it. If I wanted to save my house, void the fines, and absolutely destroy Brenda's authority in one single nuclear legal maneuver, I couldn't just be a guy with a few hens anymore. I had to become a full-blown commercial farmer. I didn't go to sleep. I opened a new browser tab. I pulled up the application for a Florida Department of Agriculture limited poultry and egg farm permit. I pulled up the Hernando County requirements for an agricultural property tax exemption. I needed a larger flock, a much larger flock, and I needed another agricultural vector to solidify the commercial aspect of the business. I researched rapidly, my fingers flying across the keyboard. What requires minimal physical space but qualifies as heavy protected agricultural production in the state of Florida? Bees. Commercial apiaries were highly, aggressively protected under state law because of their vital importance to crop pollination. By 6 a.m., as the sun began to rise over the humid, swampy Spring Hill horizon, casting long shadows across my lawn, I had my credit card out, and I was filling out official state registry forms. I registered a brand new, limited liability company with the Florida Division of Corporations. I was no longer just a terrified homeowner in violation of Article 4, Section 12. I was the CEO of Spring Hill Heritage Farms, LLC, and I was about to go to absolute war. Honestly, deciding to become a commercial farmer at 6 in the morning on a Wednesday is one thing. Actually executing it before a corporate law firm files a lien at the county courthouse and literally seizes your house is, like, a completely different level of sheer, unadulterated panic. I mean, I had the paperwork. The LLC was registered. But the state of Florida doesn't just hand out agricultural exemptions because you filled out an online form. You have to prove it. You need a physical inspection, which meant I had maybe 48 hours to turn a quarter acre of aggressively manicured suburban grass into a high-yield, high-volume agricultural facility. My first problem was volume. 3 chickens do not make a farm. By 6:30 a.m., I was on the phone with a commercial hatchery out in the Midwest. Have you ever ordered live animals over the phone? It is a wild experience. "Hi, yes," I said, my voice cracking slightly from the caffeine overdose. "I need chickens, a lot of them, as fast as legally possible." The lady on the phone sounded completely unfazed. "All right, hun. What breed and how many?" "Rhode Island Reds," I said. "And I guess 47 of them? That makes an even 50. We can ship day-old chicks via USPS Priority Mail Express," she replied, chewing loudly on what sounded like a piece of gum. "They'll be at your local post office tomorrow morning. That'll be $380 plus overnight shipping." I handed over my credit card number without a second thought. I was literally buying 50 birds through the mail. But chickens take months to lay eggs. I needed an immediate, undeniable commercial product to show the state inspector. I needed the ultimate agricultural trump card. I needed bees. I jumped onto Craigslist. By some absolute miracle, I found a guy out in the deep, swampy woods of Brooksville who was liquidating his apiary business. I called him at 7:15 a.m. "I need 4 established, fully functioning commercial beehives," I told him, "and I need to pick them up today. Right now." "Bring cash and a truck with a cap," the guy grunted. "And a suit if you ain't used to getting stung." I didn't have a truck. I had a mid-sized crossover SUV, and I definitely didn't have a beekeeper suit. But I had a desperate, petty need for revenge, which honestly feels like the same thing. I drove out to Brooksville, handed a guy named Swampy Steve $1,200 in cash, and watched in sheer terror as he loaded 4 massive, heavy wooden boxes into the back of my SUV. The boxes were literally vibrating. A low, aggressive, collective hum filled the cabin of my car. "Just keep the AC blasting and don't get into an accident," Steve chuckled, slapping the roof of my car. "They're a little agitated." I drove the 45 minutes back to Spring Hill, sitting completely rigid, both hands glued to the steering wheel, convinced that at any moment, 1,000,000 angry bees were going to break loose and end my life on the Suncoast Parkway. But I made it. I parked the SUV in the garage, left the windows down, and sprinted inside to tackle the biggest hurdle: infrastructure. I couldn't just throw 47 baby chicks and 1,000,000 bees into the yard. I needed a massive commercial-grade poultry run, and I needed it built yesterday. I opened Facebook Marketplace and searched for local contractors. I skipped past the licensed corporate guys with branded trucks. They would take weeks, and they would demand HOA architectural approval before they even swung a hammer. I needed a mercenary. I found a listing that was literally just a blurry photo of a DeWalt drill. The text read, "Mike's Carpentry." I build stuff fast. Don't text me after 7 p.m. I don't pull permits for stupid projects. It was a match made in heaven. I called him. "Mike," I said, "I need a 400-square-foot commercial chicken enclosure built in my backyard, fully enclosed, hardware cloth, heavy timber. I need it done in 48 hours. "That's a massive footprint," Mike said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble. "You live in a subdivision?" "Whispering Pines." Mike actually laughed out loud. "Buddy, Whispering Pines has the strictest HOA in Hernando County. They won't let me build a doghouse over there without a blood sample and a certified blueprint. I am currently bypassing the HOA by legally converting my property into a commercial farm," I explained. "The HOA has threatened to foreclose on my house over 3 existing chickens. I am doing this entirely out of spite, and I am willing to pay an emergency rush fee." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I absolutely hate HOAs," Mike said, his tone shifting from contractor to co-conspirator. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Mike pulled up to my house in a battered lifted Ford F-250 diesel that sounded like a jet engine taking off. He was a mountain of a man. He had a thick gray beard, mirrored sunglasses, and arms covered in faded tattoos. He walked into my backyard, took one look at my tiny, aesthetic little coop, and then looked at my property lines. "So," Mike grunted, pulling a tape measure off his belt and letting it snap. "They want to take your house over that?" He pointed at Henrietta, who was currently trying to eat a piece of mulch. "Yep." "Okay," Mike smiled, a slow, wicked smile. "Where do you want the new superstructure?" "I want it to take up the entire back half of the yard," I said. "And the 4 beehives in my garage? I want them placed exactly over there." I pointed to the far left corner of my yard. Mike squinted behind his sunglasses. He looked at the corner, then looked over the 4-foot chain-link fence. "Buddy," Mike said slowly, "that's literally right on the property line. That is exactly 3 inches away from your neighbor's screened-in patio." "That's Brenda's house," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "I want Brenda to smell the honey while she drinks her morning chamomile tea. I want her to hear the buzzing in her nightmares. I want her to look out her window and see a towering monument to agricultural freedom." Mike threw his head back and laughed. "I love it. My crew is on the way." Within an hour, my quiet suburban street was transformed into an active, high-decibel construction zone. Mike didn't just bring a crew, he brought an invasion force. 3 guys who looked like they moonlighted as professional lumberjacks pulled up in another truck. A massive flatbed delivery truck from the local lumber yard backed aggressively into my pristine, HOA-mandated driveway. They didn't gently unload the wood. They unstrapped the flatbed and let a colossal stack of pressure-treated 4x4 posts and plywood crash directly onto my manicured lawn with an earth-shattering boom. Mike's crew set up sawhorses right in the grass. They plugged in massive industrial chop saws. And, most importantly, they brought a heavy-duty job site radio. They cranked it to maximum volume, blasting AC/DC so loud the bass physically vibrated my back windows. It was glorious chaos. Wood chips were flying, saws were screaming, and I was standing on my back porch drinking a cup of coffee, watching the foundation of my revenge being built in real time. It took Brenda exactly 45 minutes to notice. I saw her marching down the sidewalk through the gaps in the fence. She wasn't just walking. She was speed-walking with terrifying, rigid purpose. And she wasn't alone. She had called for backup. Trailing behind her were two older guys in matching pastel polo shirts, the infamous Architectural Review Committee. Brenda looked like she was about to have a literal medical event. Her face was the color of an overripe tomato. "Stop work!" she shrieked, her voice somehow cutting through the roaring guitar solo of Thunderstruck. "Stop this work immediately!" Mike didn't even look up. He just kept driving 3-inch deck screws into a massive wooden corner post with an impact driver. Brrrap! Brrrap! Brenda marched right up to my chain-link fence and violently rattled the gate. "I am talking to you! Who is in charge of this? This abomination!" I took a slow sip of my coffee, walked down the porch steps, and casually strolled over to the fence. "Morning, Brenda," I smiled, leaning against the metal. "Beautiful day for some heavy construction, don't you think?" "What are you doing?" she demanded, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at the massive wooden skeleton that was rapidly taking over my yard. "You did not submit an architectural variance request. You did not get board approval. You do not have an approved color palette. You do not have county permits for an outbuilding of this size." "I don't need them," I said calmly. The two guys from the review committee scoffed loudly, stepping up to the fence to flank Brenda. "Excuse me?" the guy in the pink polo said, crossing his arms. "Every structure over 100 square feet requires HOA approval and a county building permit. You are in direct violation of the CC&Rs. We are calling county code enforcement right now, and they will red tag this project." "Go ahead," I said. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I held it up against the chain link so they could read the bold print. "Because this isn't an outbuilding, it's an agricultural facility." Brenda squinted at the paper. "What is that?" "This is my official state registration," I beamed. "I am legally registered as Spring Hill Heritage Farms, LLC. And under the Florida Right to Farm Act, local zoning, county code enforcement, and your cute little HOA rulebook do not apply to bona fide agricultural operations." Brenda stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. Her brain literally could not process the concept of someone defying her authority with a higher state-level law. "You are not a farm," she yelled, her voice cracking. "You are a man in a subdivision with 3 dirty birds." "Oh, I'm expanding," I assured her. I pointed toward the garage. "In fact, I've just diversified into apiaries." Right on cue, Mike and one of his guys walked out of the garage, each wearing a protective veil, carrying the first of the 4 massive, buzzing wooden beehives. They walked it straight over to the property line, exactly 3 inches from Brenda's fence, and set it down in the grass. Brenda gasped, stumbling backward so fast she almost tripped over the curb. "Bees? You are bringing swarms of bees into a residential neighborhood?" "They're livestock," I shrugged, giving her a look of faux innocence. "Just like you said in your citation, Brenda. You wanted to treat my pets like farm animals? Congratulations. You get the whole farm." "I am calling the police," she yelled, pulling her phone out of her pocket with violently shaking hands. "I am calling the sheriff. I am calling code enforcement. I'm calling the fire department. I'm calling our lawyers." "The sheriff's deputies already told you it's a civil issue," I reminded her cheerfully. "But please, call code enforcement. I'd absolutely love to chat with them." She let out a sound of pure, unfiltered frustration, like a tea kettle boiling over, turned on her heel, and practically dragged her 2 committee members down the street. Mike walked over, wiping sweat from his forehead with a dirty rag. He looked over the fence at Brenda's retreating figure, then looked at me. "She seems nice," he deadpanned. "Oh, she's an absolute peach," I laughed. "Think you can get the roof on this thing by tomorrow afternoon?" Mike looked at the massive structure, then at his crew. "For you? And to spite her? We'll string up floodlights and work through the night." And they did. I didn't sleep a wink. Between the hum of the portable generator, The constant whine of power saws, and the fact that my local post office called me at 5 a.m. to tell me a box of 47 chirping baby chicks had arrived on the loading dock, my adrenaline was completely maxed out. By 2 p.m. the next day, the coop was entirely finished. And honestly, it was a masterpiece. It was a sprawling, fortified complex of heavy timber and galvanized wire that smelled strongly of fresh pine sap and absolute defiance. The 47 chicks were safely settled into the heated, pine-shaving-lined brooding section, peeping loudly. Henrietta, Beatrice, and Mabel were already strutting around the massive, enclosed run like absolute queens, scratching at the fresh dirt. The 4 beehives were set up in a perfect, intimidating row, humming aggressively in the corner, literally inches from Brenda's property line. The trap was fully set. All I needed was the bait. Right on cue, a white pickup truck with the Hernando County seal on the door pulled into my driveway, and pulling in directly behind it, blocking it in, was Brenda's pristine Lexus SUV. She hopped out, looking incredibly smug, holding her green clipboard like a shield. She marched up the driveway alongside a guy wearing a heavy canvas shirt and carrying a thick tablet. This was the local county code enforcement officer. She had actually managed to drag him out here. "Right this way, officer," Brenda announced loudly, making absolutely sure I could hear her from where I was standing on the porch. "As you will clearly see, it is an illegal, unpermitted structure of massive proportions, operating an illegal commercial business in a strict residential zone." The code enforcement guy sighed heavily. He walked up to my fence. He looked at the massive chicken run. He looked at the 50 birds inside. He looked at the row of beehives. "Sir," the officer said to me, sounding completely exhausted with his life choices, "I'm gonna need to see your approved county building permits for this structure. And I'm telling you right now, you cannot have commercial apiaries this close to a neighboring dwelling under county residential code. I'm going to have to issue a stop work order and a notice of demolition." Brenda smiled. It was a terrifying, victorious smirk. I didn't argue. I didn't get mad. I just took a sip of my sparkling water, smiled back at her, and pointed toward the street. Pulling up right behind Brenda's Lexus was a green, unmarked state vehicle. On the side door, in official gold lettering, was the seal of the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. A tall, incredibly thin guy with wire-rimmed glasses, a slightly wrinkled button-down shirt, and a state-issued clipboard stepped out of the car. This was Gary. I had called Gary's office 3 days ago, begged his secretary, and requested an emergency site inspection for my new agricultural LLC to finalize my state certification. Gary walked up the driveway, looking slightly confused by the crowd gathered at the fence. Excuse me," Gary asked, adjusting his glasses and looking at his clipboard. "I'm looking for the registered owner of Spring Hill Heritage Farms." "That's me," I said, unlatching the gate and swinging it open. "Come on in, Gary." The county code enforcement officer looked over his shoulder. He saw the green state vehicle parked in the street. He saw the official gold seal of the Florida Department of Agriculture. He saw Gary's state-issued badge dangling from a blue lanyard around his neck. You could literally watch the authority drain out of the county guy's body in real time. In the absolute, unyielding hierarchy of government bureaucracy, county code enforcement officers are basically mall cops, and state agricultural inspectors are the apex predators. It's not even a contest. Gary unlatched my chain-link gate and stepped into the yard. Brenda immediately tried to physically block his path. She stepped in front of him, holding her neon-green clipboard up like a shield. "Excuse me, stop right there," Brenda barked, using her maximum HOA President voice. "Who do you think you are? We are in the middle of an active code enforcement investigation. This man has built an illegal structure, and we are red-tagging the property." Gary stopped. He looked at Brenda. He looked at her clipboard. Then he slowly pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose. He didn't look angry. He didn't look intimidated. He just looked profoundly, deeply bored. Gary was a state bureaucrat. He possessed a level of immunity to suburban drama that I could only dream of. "Ma'am," Gary said, his voice completely flat. "I am Gary Miller, Senior Field Inspector for the Florida Department of Agriculture. I am here to conduct a scheduled site inspection for a registered commercial farm. If you are not the property owner or an employee of the LLC, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the commercial livestock area." Biosecurity protocols. Brenda's mouth fell open. She literally gasped. "Commercial livestock? He is a man in a subdivision. Look at this mess." Gary completely ignored her. He sidestepped around Brenda like she was a mildly annoying piece of lawn furniture and walked over to me. "Mr. Ibrahim?" Gary asked, looking at his clipboard. "That's me," I smiled, shaking his hand. "Right," Gary sighed. "Let's get this over with. I need to verify your flock count, check the housing dimensions for state humane compliance, verify your feed and water setups, and take a look at the apiaries to ensure they meet the minimum required distance from the primary domicile. Lead the way." For the next 30 minutes, Gary conducted the most meticulous, excruciatingly boring inspection I have ever witnessed, and it was absolutely beautiful. He pulled a tape measure out of his pocket and measured the square footage of the chicken run. He nodded approvingly. He counted the 47 baby chicks under the heat lamps. He checked the automatic waterers. He inspected the feed bags to make sure I was using commercial-grade layer pellets. Through all of this, Brenda was hyperventilating by the fence. She was pacing back and forth, furiously whispering to the county code enforcement guy, who was currently leaning against his truck, checking his phone, completely checked out of the situation. "Officer!" Brenda hissed at the county guy. "Do something! Issue the demolition notice! Write the citation! Stop this man!" The county code officer looked up from his phone. "Brenda, I literally can't. If the state clears him, the county has zero jurisdiction here. My hands are tied. He's not a farm. It's a backyard." "Tell it to the state of Florida, Brenda," the guy sighed. Gary finished with the chickens and walked over to the far corner of the yard, where the 4 massive beehives were buzzing loudly. He pulled a protective netting veil out of his pocket, slipped it over his head, and walked right up to the property line. He checked the hive entrances. He verified the colony strength. Then, Gary walked back over to me, pulled off his veil, and took out a pen. "Well," Gary said, scribbling on a thick stack of carbon copy forms, "everything looks completely up to state standards. The enclosure is structurally sound and predator-proof. The biosecurity measures are adequate. Your flock density is well within commercial parameters, and the apiary is properly established for commercial yield. Based on the volume and the infrastructure, this clearly meets the state definition of a bona fide agricultural operation." He ripped the top copy off the stack. It was a bright pink piece of heavy paper. "I am officially approving your agricultural classification, effective immediately," Gary said, handing me the pink slip. "Your property is now under the jurisdiction and protection of the Florida Department of Agriculture. Congratulations, you're a farm." I took the slip of paper. It felt like holding a winning lottery ticket. "Thanks, Gary. Honestly, you have no idea what this means to me. Just keep the waterers clean, and make sure you file your agricultural tax exemption with the county appraiser before March," Gary muttered, already walking back toward his green state vehicle. As Gary drove away, the county code enforcement officer pushed himself off his truck. He walked up to the fence, tipped his imaginary hat to me, and gave Brenda a weary look. "Have a good afternoon, Brenda," he said. "Don't call us about this address again. There's nothing we can do." He got in his truck and drove off. It was just me and Brenda left. I stood in my yard, holding the laminated pink slip. The 50 chickens were clucking softly behind me. The bees were buzzing over the property line. The afternoon sun was shining. I felt like I had just conquered Rome. Brenda stood in my driveway, her knuckles completely white as she gripped her clipboard. She was shaking, actually shaking. Her transition lenses were perfectly dark now, but I could feel the absolute, unfiltered hatred radiating from her eyes. "This isn't over," she whispered, her voice tight and raspy. "You think you're so smart. You think some state technicality is going to save you. But we have a contract. You signed the CCNRs. The board has already retained legal counsel." "The state supersedes the contract, Brenda," I said casually, folding the pink slip and sliding it into my pocket. "We'll see about that," she spat. "We have an emergency board meeting on Thursday night. Our lawyers are coming. I am going to push through the foreclosure motion. I am going to file the lien, and I am going to take this house from you. I will see you on Thursday." She turned, her orthopedic shoes clicking furiously on the concrete, and marched back to her Lexus. She peeled out of my driveway, leaving a faint black tire mark on the pristine HOA pavement. I looked down at Henrietta, who had wandered out of the massive run to inspect Gary's footprints in the dirt. "Well, girl," I said, leaning down and tossing her a handful of dried mealworms. "Looks like we're going to court. Or, the community clubhouse. Same difference. But honestly, even with the state certification in my pocket, the next 48 hours were pure, unfiltered anxiety. It's one thing to read the statutes online and act tough in your driveway. It's a completely different thing to actually face down a corporate law firm that has the power to seize your physical home. What if I missed a loophole? What if the HOA's lawyers found some obscure precedent that invalidated my farm status? What if they just bulldozed through the legalities and filed the lien anyway, tying me up in expensive civil litigation for years until I went bankrupt? My wife tried to calm me down. She kept pointing at the pink slip on the fridge. "The state inspector said, 'You're a farm. You're a farm. Just breathe.'" But I couldn't breathe. I spent Wednesday night pacing the living room, rehearsing my arguments, printing out duplicate copies of Florida Statute Section 823.14, and highlighting the relevant preemption clauses in bright yellow marker. I compiled everything into a thick manila folder. It was my shield. Thursday night finally rolled around. The Whispering Pines Community Clubhouse was this massive, overly opulent building at the front of the neighborhood that looked like a fake Mediterranean villa. Normally, board meetings were attended by maybe 4 or 5 people who just wanted to complain about the trash pickup schedule. But tonight, the parking lot was completely overflowing. Cars were parked on the grass. People were walking in from blocks away. Word had spread like wildfire. I mean, it's not every day someone turns their suburban backyard into a literal, high-volume agricultural zone just out of pure, concentrated spite to fight a foreclosure. The neighborhood gossip mill was in absolute overdrive. I put on a crisp, light blue button-down shirt, tucked it into my darkest pair of jeans, grabbed my manila folder, and walked down the street to the clubhouse. When I opened the double glass doors, a wave of cold air and intense, chaotic whispering hit me in the face. The room was packed to the absolute brim. There were at least 150 people crammed into the folding metal chairs. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in 3 years were huddled together in groups, pointing, holding styrofoam cups of terrible decaf coffee, and buzzing with anticipation. The air conditioning was fighting a completely losing battle against the body heat of the crowd. I walked down the center aisle. The moment people saw me, the whispers dropped to a dead, heavy silence. You literally could have heard a pin drop on the cheap commercial carpet. At the front of the room, sitting on a raised dais like a panel of corrupted Supreme Court justices, was the HOA board. Brenda was seated right in the absolute center. She was wearing a sharp, navy blue blazer, her hair perfectly shellacked. She looked smug. She looked victorious. But it was the guy sitting next to her that made my stomach do a nervous flip. He wasn't a board member. He was wearing a sharp, incredibly expensive-looking tailored gray suit. He had a silver Rolex on his wrist, a stack of legal pads perfectly aligned in front of him, and he was casually clicking a silver pen. This was the retained counsel. This was the shark Brenda had hired to take my house. I took a seat in the back row, crossed my legs, set my folder on my lap, and tried to look as bored and unbothered as humanly possible. Brenda picked up her wooden gavel and slammed it down onto the folding table. Bang! 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 This emergency special meeting of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association is now officially called to order, she announced. Her voice boomed through the microphone, echoing off the high ceilings. She glared directly at me over the heads of the crowd, her eyes practically vibrating with malice. "We have a very full agenda tonight," Brenda continued, adjusting her microphone. "But we are going to start with the most pressing, urgent issue threatening the safety and property values of our community. The board is introducing a formal motion to proceed with a property lien and immediate foreclosure action against the residents at 442 Oakmont Drive." A collective, sharp gasp went through the room. A few people actually turned around in their chairs to look at me with wide eyes. Foreclosure is the ultimate suburban boogeyman. It's the nuclear option. The idea that a group of unpaid, power-tripping volunteers could literally seize your actual house, auction it off, and throw your family onto the street is terrifying. And Brenda was wielding that power like a medieval executioner's axe. "For the official record," Brenda said, pulling out her neon green clipboard and reading from it like a scroll of absolute truth. "The homeowner in question has repeatedly, flagrantly, and aggressively violated the community covenants. He has ignored fines currently totaling $12,450. $12,000. My jaw tightened. The fake, compounded administrative fees had jumped another $2,000 just in the last 48 hours. It was a complete, literal shakedown. "Furthermore," she sneered, leaning into the microphone so her voice distorted slightly, "he has constructed a massive, unapproved shantytown in his backyard. He has brought dangerous swarms of stinging insects into a dense residential zone. He claims to be operating a commercial business. He is a menace to the community standards." She gestured grandly to the man in the gray suit next to her. "We have retained Mr. Sterling here, from the firm of Sterling, Vance and Hughes in Tampa, to ensure this foreclosure is executed swiftly, legally, and without delay. The Whispering Pines neighborhood will not be held hostage by a rogue resident who thinks he is above the rules. Mr. Sterling, do you have the legal documents prepared for the board's signature?" The lawyer, Mr. Sterling, stopped clicking his pen. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, cleared his throat, and looked out at the crowd with a mixture of absolute pity and corporate boredom. "I do, Madam President," Sterling said smoothly, his voice deep and authoritative. "If the board votes to approve the motion tonight, my firm will formally file the lien at the county clerk's office tomorrow morning at exactly 8 a.m. Under Florida property law, if the debt is not satisfied immediately, eviction proceedings and property seizure can begin within 30 days. Brenda smiled. It was a cold, terrifying, reptilian smile. She looked right at me. She thought she had won. She thought she had completely backed me into a corner, crushed me under the weight of her authority, and destroyed my life. "Are there any final comments from the floor?" Brenda asked, her tone dripping with mock, sickening sympathy. "Before we vote to remove this individual from our community?" I didn't hesitate. I stood up from my metal folding chair. I didn't rush. I casually smoothed out the front of my shirt, picked up my manila folder, and walked slowly down the center aisle. The entire room watched me in absolute, breathless silence. You could literally feel the tension in the air. I walked right up to the front table, stopping directly in front of the expensive lawyer. "I have a few comments," I said. I reached over, pulled the microphone stand slightly toward me, and tapped the mic to make sure it was hot. I looked out at the massive crowd of my neighbors, then turned and looked directly into Brenda's smug face. "First of all, Brenda," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the room, "I honestly want to say thank you." Brenda frowned, her perfectly drawn eyebrows pulling together in confusion. "No, I mean it," I continued. "If you hadn't sent me that very first petty $50 fine over one 4-pound Rhode Island red chicken, I never would have discovered my true calling and passion in life." Brenda rolled her eyes aggressively. "This is not a joke. This is not a comedy club. You are about to lose your home, and you are wasting our time." "Am I?" I asked, feigning deep surprise. I popped the clasp on my manila folder. "Because according to the government of the state of Florida, I'm not a rogue resident. I'm not a menace. I am an essential, legally protected piece of the state's agricultural economy." I pulled out the bright pink slip Gary, the inspector, had handed me. I slapped it down onto the folding table with a loud smack, right on top of Mr. Sterling's neatly stacked legal pads. "That," I said, projecting my voice so the people all the way in the back row could hear me, "is an official, approved, and fully registered state certification classifying my property as a bona fide commercial agricultural operation operating under the name Spring Hill Heritage Farms, LLC. Then, I pulled out the stapled packet of paper containing my highlighted statutes. I slapped that down right next to the pink slip. "And this," I continued, pointing to the packet, "is the Florida Right to Farm Act. Florida Statute Section 823.14. Mr. Sterling, as a high-priced, heavily retained corporate attorney, I'm sure you're intimately familiar with the legal doctrine of state preemption." Mr. Sterling stopped clicking his pen. He looked down at the pink slip. He looked at the LLC registration. He picked up the copy of the statute, and his eyes quickly scanned the highlighted sections. And as he read it, his face instantly lost all of its color. He went from looking like a bored, confident corporate shark to a guy who just realized he forgot to pack his parachute halfway out of the airplane door. He swallowed hard. "What is that?" Brenda demanded, leaning over her chair to look at the papers. "What is he talking about? Mr. Sterling, ignore him. Let's proceed with the board vote." Mr. Sterling stammered. His smooth, authoritative voice was completely gone. He pulled nervously at his collar. "Hold on, Madam President. Just give me a moment to review this." "I'll explain it for you, Brenda," I said, leaning casually against the edge of their table. "Under the Florida Right to Farm Act, local governments, municipalities, and yes, even private homeowners associations are strictly, legally prohibited from regulating, restricting, outlawing, or harassing bona fide agricultural operations. State law completely and totally overrides your private CC&Rs. The crowd started whispering loudly again. A low murmur of shock rippled through the folding chairs. I held up my hands, playing directly to the audience now. This was my moment. This was the ultimate malicious compliance, and I was going to milk every single second of it. "What this means," I said, pacing slowly back and forth in front of the table, "is that not only are my 50 chickens and my 4 commercial beehives completely legal, but every single fine you have levied against me is null and void, unenforceable. You literally have no legal authority to collect a single dime from me. But wait, everyone, it actually gets better." I turned back to Brenda, whose face was now twitching violently with suppressed rage. "Because my entire property is now legally recognized by the state as a farm," I said, leaning in so the microphone caught every word. "Your HOA rules no longer apply to my property at all. That means I don't need your board approval for my fences. I don't need your approval for my outbuildings. Your required paint palettes? Void. Your mandated lawn height requirements? Void. Your restrictive parking rules? Void." I paused for dramatic effect, looking out at the crowd. In fact, as a commercial farm, I am legally protected and allowed to park heavy agricultural machinery on my property, which is fantastic news because I'm looking at buying a used diesel John Deere tractor next week, and I'm going to park it right in the middle of my driveway, just in case I need to do some plowing. A guy in the third row literally burst out laughing. It broke the tension completely. The rest of the crowd joined in. It started as a chuckle, and then it swelled into genuine uproarious laughter. The dam had finally broken. For years, these people had been absolutely tortured by Brenda's insane, microscopic rules. They had been fined for weeds, fined for garbage cans, fined for holiday decorations, and now they were watching her entire empire completely crumble in real time, defeated by a guy who weaponized a flock of chickens. "He's lying!" Brenda shrieked. She grabbed her gavel and started banging it frantically against the table, trying to quiet the room. "Bang! Bang! Bang! Mr. Sterling, tell them he's lying! We have a signed contract! The CC&Rs are ironclad!" Mr. Sterling slowly put the state paperwork down on the table. He didn't look at Brenda. He looked up at me, and honestly, there was actually a glint of genuine professional respect in his eyes. He knew he had been completely outplayed. "Madam President," the lawyer said, his voice quiet, tense, and suddenly very tired. "He has an active state agricultural certification. The Florida Right to Farm Act it's ironclad. It was explicitly designed by the legislature to protect commercial farms from residential encroachment and nuisance lawsuits. But he's not a real farm. He's a guy in a subdivision trying to get out of a fine." The state inspector disagreed. Mr. Sterling sighed, rubbing his temples with his fingertips. "The state granted the classification. If you attempt to proceed with this foreclosure, or if you attempt to place a lien on this property, he will countersue the HOA in state court for harassment, violation of his right to farm protections, and tortious interference with his commercial business." "Then we fight him in court!" Brenda yelled, completely losing her mind. "Madam President," Mr. Sterling said sharply, finally showing some teeth. "He will win. State law preempts your contract, and when he wins, the court will force the HOA to pay his legal fees, plus punitive damages. The financial liability alone will completely bankrupt this association. I strongly, professionally advise you to drop the fines and withdraw the foreclosure motion immediately." The room erupted. People were cheering. A group of neighbors in the back actually stood up and started clapping. It was absolute pandemonium. Brenda sat there, completely frozen in her chair. The wooden gavel slipped out of her trembling hand and clattered loudly onto the floor. Her face was pale, and her eyes were darting frantically around the room, looking at the cheering crowd, looking at the defeated lawyer, looking at the pink slip on the table. She realized, in that exact moment, that she had completely lost control. The terrifying power she had wielded for years over hundreds of families had just been vaporized. "Oh, and Brenda," I added, leaning in close over the table, making sure my voice cut through the cheering. "If you or any member of your architectural review committee ever step foot onto my property again without my explicit written permission, I will have you arrested for trespassing on an agricultural facility. The state takes farm biosecurity very seriously." I smiled, picked up my manila folder, and gave the crowd a little two-finger salute. "Have a great night, everyone," I said into the microphone. I turned my back on the HOA board and walked down the center aisle, straight out the double glass doors of the clubhouse, to the sound of thunderous, echoing applause.